It's all about truth. All of it. Every single thing. All boils down to the truth. We all want truth. The truth will set you free. All right, welcome to the program, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program. This is Press for Truth Live. I'm your host, Dan Dix. Today is Friday, November the 6th, 2015, and we have a really great show lined up for you today. I'm really excited to just get this kicked off. Joining us online today, we're going to be speaking with Jeff Berwick of the Dollar Vigilante. He's going to be joining us to discuss the recent spike in Bitcoin and what this could potentially mean for the gold and silver markets as well. And we're also going to be speaking to an in-studio guest today. We're going to be joined by Mike Rhodes, who is a monetary reform expert. He's going to be speaking on the case to reform the Bank of Canada. So be sure to get your questions in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring the chat window here. So get your questions in for both of today's guests, because with so many things going on in the world right now, these are some guys that we can look to for some answers. I mean, right now, I think what ought to be in the top forefront of the mainstream news is this Russian airplane that just recently went down, killing, I think it's 224 people on board, crashing over the Egyptian desert. Now, we know that the Islamic State is apparently claiming responsibility for this downed plane, but as we here at Press for Truth know and have been saying for quite some time, ISIS is a creation of the West, and they have been using these guys to destabilize the Middle East. Now, when you consider that, you know, Syria and Iran are some of these countries that have yet to have a Rothschild installed centralized bank, you start to see the bigger picture of really what's going on and what's at play here. So I find it interesting that while all this is going on with these Rothschilds trying to set up the centralized banks in the Middle East, we now have things like Bitcoin exploding through the roof in the last few days. So I want to bring on our first guest, Jeff Berwick, to talk a little about, first of all, the fact that we have all these things going on in the Middle East, and now we have things going on in the world. So we are joined here on Skype by Jeff Berwick. Jeff, man, thanks so much for joining us here in the PFT studio, brother.
Always a pleasure, Dan. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, man, it's great to have you here. So I want to get your take a little bit about what on earth has been happening with Bitcoin in the last couple of days. I'm curious as to what triggered this spike. First of all, take us back to where we were last week with Bitcoin compared to where we are today.
Yeah, Bitcoin, I've been writing at the Dollar Vigilante that Bitcoin has been very stable at around the $230, $250 level all year, which is highly unusual for Bitcoin. Of course, one of the big things that people say about Bitcoin that's negative is it's very volatile, and it was incredibly unvolatile for most of the year, leading me to write in the summer of this year that I think now is the time to get in around $230. And then it was just in the last month that it started to rise. It quite quickly went up to around 270, 280. And then in the last few days, very Bitcoin-like, it skyrocketed from 280 and hit a high of $500 just yesterday. But it wasn't at 500 very long, and it quickly went back to 400. I believe it's currently at about 370. So definitely a big move in Bitcoin. There's no way to know, of course, exactly what the reason is, but I think we're headed towards a major financial crisis collapse. We're seeing governments around the world clamping down capital controls. We're seeing every central bank in the world printing money. Anyone who's half awake knows this system's going down, and soon. We're not talking years. We're talking months at most. And so to me, the Bitcoin rise could be a canary in the coal mine sort of a thing. The one thing I pointed out at the Dollar Vigilante is that I found in the past watching Bitcoin, of course, Bitcoin just had its 7th birthday this week, so it's only 7 years old. So it's a very short time period to really make some judgments on what Bitcoin means as far as its movements. But I've always noticed that gold and silver is highly manipulated by central banks, and Bitcoin isn't. And so we saw in 2013 with the Cyprus bank bail-in, which was just a daylight robbery by the central banks and the government of bank deposit holders in Cyprus. Bitcoin at that time went from $35 to about $250 in about a month, I believe. Gold and silver did nothing because it's the paper price of gold and silver is completely controlled, or almost completely controlled. And so, yes, this could be a sort of a canary in the coal mine, sort of a warning. I'm definitely watching it because I've seen in the past Bitcoin lead the markets in certain areas, and so this could be another case of it leading the market.
Do you think people are generally just becoming aware and waking up to some of the things that the government are doing? You mentioned Cyprus. That was just a blatant robbery of the people's hard-earned money, their pensions. Is it because of things like Cyprus, but because of what people are witnessing happening in Greece? And we've seen austerity measures all over the world. Is that why they're looking to Bitcoin, gold, silver, these types of things? I mean, people are looking to Bitcoin, but why not look to gold and silver as well? I mean, how controlled are the gold and silver markets, and is that still a safe bet?
It's very controlled, and what we're going to see is a complete separation of the paper price of gold and silver to the actual hard price of gold and silver. So what I mean by that is that we will see, we have seen the margin, the difference between the price of silver, for example, of the paper price and the actual, if you want to buy the bullion in itself, in physical bullion, has been huge. It's been, I believe, about 50% above margin for junk silver in the last few months. I'm here in Mexico right now, and I haven't been able to find any silver coins for months. I have people from around the world reporting that there's very hard to get silver anywhere. I predicted this for the last few years that this will happen. This will also happen with gold, is that by the time that people realize they should be buying it, they probably will have a very hard time to actually get it. And things like the ETFs on the stock exchanges are just paper. And those definitely, if you're buying those because you want to buy gold and silver, you're not. You're just buying paper. So yeah, we're going to see a lot of things happening over the coming years. And yes, you're right. People are waking up, and it's mostly thanks to the internet. The internet is now widespread around the world. In the last 10 years, if you look back 10 years ago, there wasn't really YouTube. There wasn't really Facebook. A lot of people still weren't really on it except for email. But in the last 10 years, especially with smartphones, people around the world, even in underdeveloped countries, everyone has access to the internet. So they're getting real information like they get at Press for Truth, and not from the lamestream media prostitutes that put out nothing but propaganda through their television programming, and people are waking up to that. So there's going to be a massive paradigm shift coming in the next few years as all these things come to a head.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And I think people are starting to recognize this. In fact, they're tuning in right now, and we have some questions coming in from the chat for you. We have a question here from Undead Recon as well as Kevin. Both are asking, can we trust something like Bitcoin? And also the second question, do you think that Bitcoin will find its way into the rest of the market, like, say, to buy a coffee?
Yeah, as far as trusting Bitcoin, it was started in 2009. It really didn't have any acknowledgement by anybody, including myself, till 2011. That's when I first heard about it, and I'm on top of these things. So if I just heard about it then, most people probably didn't even hear about it till a few years later. When I first heard about it, I was so excited once I heard what it was, because it's the first of its money of its type, a cryptocurrency that is completely uncontrolled by and not able to be controlled by governments or central banks, which are the two most evil institutions in the world and mankind's two biggest enemies. And when I heard about it, I was so happy. And of course, I've been involved in it since 2011, so about 4 years now. And the more that I have found out about it, the more I love it. First of all, it's open source software, so there's nothing nefarious put in it. Anyone can look at what it is. It's on thousands of computers around the world. It can't be controlled by anyone, the same way that torrents were with music in the old days, things like Napster and things like that, or torrents nowadays. So as far as can you trust it, I guess the question is, what can you trust? What I've learned in this world is that almost everything is a illusion. Almost everything is a lie. I trust something that I can actually see with my own eyes and not behind closed-door boardrooms with a bunch of criminals like Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan, and they're just the puppets, just the same way Barack Obama is just a puppet. They're the teleprompter readers. The real evil people were the people that we tracked down in Austria this summer at Bilderberg.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to get the fact that you are a Canadian, Jeff. I want to get also your take on what's going on in Canada. I mean, we currently have a new prime minister has been elected not too long ago. And we also have the case with the Bank of Canada going on here. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Have you heard of COMER, the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform, and their plans to essentially sue the Bank of Canada and to reinstate the Bank of Canada back into how it's been pre-1974?
Yes, I've heard about it. Of course, I'm for anything that gets rid of central banks. But if their goal is for the government to print money itself, that's probably the only thing that could possibly be worse than having the central banks printed, is a bunch of crazy fascio communists, socialists in a so-called democracy printing up money for anything they want. And that would actually result in hyperinflation much faster than the central banks could even do it.
A very, very interesting take. And, in fact, I want to bring in our in-studio guest. He's going to be talking a little bit about the Bank of Canada case. But, you mentioned that if this is a so-called democracy, in fact, what we are under is a constitutional monarchy. And I have never, ever really... It's never been so solidified in my mind that we are essentially slaves to the Queen until I recently saw Justin Trudeau's oath to office, I guess you could say. So we're going to cut to a video. I want you to take a listen here, Jeff, as to just what Justin Trudeau had to say in order to get the oath of office. Just listen to these words carefully. And when we come back from the video, we'll be joined in studio with our guest, Mike Rhodes, to talk about the case of the bank, the case against the Bank of Canada. Here's Justin Trudeau's inaugural oath.
Mr. Justin J.P. Trudeau.
I, Justin P.J. Trudeau, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors. So help me God. I, Justin P.J. Trudeau, do solemnly and sincerely swear that I shall be a true and faithful servant to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council for Canada. I will, in all things to be treated, debated, and resolved in Privy Council, faithfully, honestly, and truly declare my mind and my opinion. I shall keep secret all matters committed and revealed to me in this capacity, or that shall be secretly treated of in Council. Generally, in all things, I shall do as a faithful and true servant ought to do for Her Majesty, so help me God. I, Justin P.J. Trudeau, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear that I will truly and faithfully, and to the best of my skill and knowledge, execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Prime Minister, so help me God.
All right, and we are back from the break, ladies and gentlemen, and if you heard what I just heard, I mean, my mind was spinning when I just first heard that the first time. I mean, I heard Harper say that years ago, but I didn't I know maybe I wasn't as awake as I am now as I was back then. But anyways, joining me in studio right now is Mike Rhodes, and he's here to talk a little bit about the case against the Bank of Canada and monetary reform here in Canada in general. So Mike, thank you so much, man, for taking some time to join us today in studio.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
So I want to get your take a little bit about this Comer case, and you've been following it. You're familiar with it. What is Comer's position on trying to reform the Bank of Canada, or what would you say the overall goal is with this case against the Bank of Canada?
Well, I just want to say from the outset, I don't speak for Comer. I'm just a friend of the association. It's a think tank in Toronto primarily. There are people in Vancouver and the West Coast here who are associated with it. The premise of their argument is it was threefold. The original statement of complaint asked for three things. One was to reinstate the full authority of the Bank of Canada to make interest-free loans to governments in Canada. Mm-hmm. The second was the second part of it was to remove tax credits from the budgeting process because they have a distorting effect on the federal budget. And the third was to ask for compensatory damages. The suit was brought forward in federal court in Toronto by Bill Krem and Ann Emmett. Mm-hmm. And Rocco Galati, who's a fairly prominent lawyer in Toronto, is the main counsel on it. Mm-hmm. I think it came forward in 2011. It finally, after all the procedural moves, finally got to a judge in 2014. And the judge ruled that it could go forward. Mm-hmm. And then there was a subsequent subject. Oh, sorry, he said
there was a number of appeals all along the way, right?
Well, not really appeals, but motions to stay.
Okay.
Motions to just strike. Procedural manipulations, if you will, is what Rocco calls it. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm trying to do the best to give your audience exactly what's going on here. But there's a lot of foot dragging going on, mm-hmm. without a lot of argument behind it from the Crown, from the Ministry of Justice is mm-hmm. pleading the case on behalf of the defendant, the Crown.
Right.
So it got to 2014. It finally got to a judge on the statement of complaint, and he said it could go forward without the compensatory damages. So the other two parts of it on reinstating the full authority of the Bank of Canada to make interest-free loans and getting rid of tax credits from the distorting mm-hmm. nature of them in the federal budget, those could go forward. But then they got a motion to subject to the revised statement of claim. The revised statement of claim came forth from Rocco in the spring, like February or March of this year. They got a motion to defer again, a motion to strike again, and it was mm-hmm. just heard, the motion to strike was just heard in Toronto Federal Court mm-hmm. on the 14th of October. That's been in the media. Right. And the judge in that case has reserved judgment. According to Rocco and the latest press I can get from Toronto is that, according to him, that means it might take the judge 2 months before he issues his order, right. his judgment on the motion to stay. From there, Rocco thinks it could take at least another 2 years to get it to trial.
Right.
So that's where it stands.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that what they're trying to do away with is charging interest on money that is created out of nothing. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Is that we began borrowing from offshore banks, the IMF, the World Bank, and the idea is to remove interest from these loans?
It's not been the idea. It's always been the mandate of the Bank of Canada.
Okay.
Is to make loans where necessary to the commercial banking system, which it does through its reserve system. But it can also make loans, interest-free loans, to governments in Canada. And in fact, in 2008, I argued they made a loan guarantee to the commercial banking sector in the middle of the crash, right in the middle mm-hmm. of the Great Recession. 2008, 2009. It's called the CLAF, Canadian Lenders Assurance Facility. Mm-hmm. So the Act says, and the lawyers, and there's a bunch of lawyer weasel stuff going on. It's kind of slimy, it's sleazy that lawyers would argue over what the meaning of may is. But it's right in the Act that mm-hmm. the bank may make interest-free loans mm-hmm. to the governments in Canada. So this is right. Federal government, provincial, municipal, okay. and probably regional. You could probably make the argument it's regional as well. Well, they haven't made interest-free loans to governments in Canada mm-hmm. since before 74.
Right.
The last time, I could be wrong on this, but one of the last big projects they funded this way from a grant from the Bank of Canada was the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is mm-hmm. an enormously important engineering feat. it cost $45 million in 1959 to complete the St. Lawrence Seaway, and today it carries tonnage that nets $45 million a week. I mean, it's an enormously important investment, right, in the country.
Yeah. Well,
But in 2008, what they did with the CLAF is they issued, they issued money to the banks who got in trouble at 100 to 150 basis points. So for your audience, 100 to 150 basis points is 1 to 1.5%. So when you and I get in trouble, we don't get a bailout. We don't get a loan guarantee for 1 and 1.5%, right? And if you take out the risk-free rate, economists will talk to you about the risk-free rate. You take the risk-free rate and net that out, it's really a non-economic loan. It's an interest-free loan.
Well, I want to get your take on this, and also Jeff's as well. If the federal government can issue loans at interest, no interest, is there any more of a need for Canadians to pay taxes? I mean, why on earth would I pay any tax if they can just print money at will? What's your take on that? And I want to get a follow-up from Jeff on that as well.
Well, Rocco in the case makes that very point, that in the budget, the amount that's in deficit generally is exactly equal to the amount of interest that the federal government is paying. So your point is a good point.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, what are your thoughts on if the federal government can produce loans at interest-free, should people have to pay taxes?
Well, let me first of all say that anyone who attacks central banks in any form, I support 100%. I'm a supporter of the End the Fed movement and really like what they're doing against the Bank of Canada. I would also say, though, that they're in the courts of the Government of Canada, which is highly unlikely they're going to overturn and allow the Central Bank of Canada to be dissolved because they are controlled by that same person that Justin Trudeau just swore allegiance to, the Queen and the financial elites who control the central banks. So the chances of that getting overturned in a court is highly unlikely in my opinion, but I wish you luck. As far as taxes are an unnecessary evil, as are governments, and we shouldn't even have at all. This has been there's only two major enemies of mankind, the governments and the central banks. And the central banks are, of course, just destroy economies through their money printing and their manipulation of interest rates. And of course, governments with enslaving all of humanity through taxation, which should be done away with as well.
I agree. I do have to agree that I think we'd be far better off without the central banks, and we have to look to who's controlling this and pulling the strings. I want to cut to another question we have from an audience member. Undead Recon asks, didn't the IMF have something to do with taking power back from the Bank of Canada? Are you familiar with...
What he's getting at is, in 1974, we agreed to join the Bank of International Settlements. Now, there's a number of supra-government financial administrators out there that go beyond national supervision, like the BIS, which is in Basel. It's the Bank of International Settlements. It has the FSB, Financial Stability Board, Financial Stability Fund. There's a million acronyms. The G7, it's all incorporated with that. The IMF, the World Bank, also play a role in this international financial supervision. But as I said, when I walked in the building today and I asked you, Dan, or maybe your other guest, maybe the other guest can answer, who's in charge of finance? Who's in charge of global finance? Mm-hmm. Well, the answer is nobody. So to say that the IMF did this or did that kind of is irrelevant. They don't, the IMF went into Greece and has basically imposed austerity. These international systems, like BIS, I think are the agents of austerity. But this is what's so great about the court case, is that all these malignancies, all these dystopic manias that I've been dealing with in my career for 25 years are bubbling to the surface. The court case has gone forward by a judge twice, so I'm not quite as cynical as your guess. I think I have a little more faith in our Canadian courts. But understand that we can't get the IMF to answer these questions. We can't even get the Bank of Canada to answer these questions. You got to understand, the Bank of Canada was chartered in 1934 to be independent of government, but it's not independent of government. It's all the shares of the Bank of Canada are owned by the government of Canada.
Well, I thought it was social. Under William Lyon Mackenzie King, it was essentially nationalized. So doesn't that technically mean that Canadians own the bank?
Ours is the only public bank.
Right.
It's not like the Federal Reserve that is owned by the regional banks. They own the shares. Our shares are owned by the Government of Canada and are held in trust as a custodian by the Minister of Finance. on behalf of the Crown and the people of Canada. And so that's where the political interference happens. It's hard to get answers about what goes on at BIS because, okay, our governor sits on BIS and he sits on FSB and he has obviously very close communications with the IMF and the World Bank. And I have less concerns about IMF or World Bank, but I have very strong concerns about BIS. What goes on there? Right. We have Canadian tax body going there. Why can't we get some answers?
Well, I wonder, maybe Jeff's also points out, like, why are we differentiating between the BIS and the IMF with the Canadian bank? What makes Canadians so special, that we're not being as controlled or can be manipulated, just like the Bank of International Settlements? Are we really that independent? Jeff?
Well, I'm not an expert, by the way, on the Bank of Canada. I am from Canada originally, but I focus mostly on the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and the bigger central banks. So I can't comment too much on exactly what goes on at the Bank of Canada. I don't really know. All I know is that there shouldn't be central banks. Central banks are a heinous, anti-human, anti-freedom institution, and we wouldn't even really need them or have them if it wasn't for taxes. Even if you look back at the 1100s with the tally sticks, when they created, they had taxation back then, back in England, and they created these tally sticks, which were just sticks, and they started to create them, and they said that you could pay your taxes in these sticks. So all of a sudden, these sticks had some value. Of course, all the currencies in the world today are fiat currencies. There's nothing backing them, especially in Canada, where this Canadian government sold all their gold, I believe, in the 1980s. There's nothing backing the Canadian dollar except for U.S. dollars, and the U.S. dollar is going to collapse anyway. So it's a heinous system, central banking, and it needs to be done away with. And that's one of the reasons I'm so into Bitcoin.
Well, as you said before, anybody who's trying to champion against the central banks in any way, shape, or form is, a friend of ours, and I would have to agree. So I mean, Mike, where do we go? I mean, the case against Comer's case against the bank is a good thing. I mean, we are in need of monetary reform here. So what would you like to see come in the future? Or, I mean, you can't speak on behalf of Comer, but you personally, where would you like to see this go in the coming months and years with the Bank of Canada? What's the ideal scenario for Canadians?
Okay, great question. Because when I was on an expert panel in 2008, in the middle of the crash, we proposed, at the time was proposed to have a common regulator for capital markets in Canada, which is a component of banking, right? And one of the things we suggested in the room over here in Vancouver is that we would have a board of directors that the executive of the Common Securities Regulator would report to. And that board of directors would have staggered terms and be appointed by the Prime Minister and so on and so forth. I think the bank, you asked me specifically what I do it. You want me to get a little more cynical, so let me take a shot at it here. I would take that building on Wellington and Ministry of Finance and bulldoze it to the ground. I would take the Bank of Canada and move it to the west side of Ottawa and put a ring fence around it and a moat, and all their communications would go through my switch. I want that thing as independent as possible. It's in fact not independent. That's, to me, what the real problem is. And that's what the case is really getting at, is how do we get these questions answered? Because we get so much political interference, right? The government, the Minister of Finance, all of whom come in the last 5 ministers of finance, except for one, arguably, as Boss did, came from Bay Street, came from Toronto, and the commercial banking sector. That is the only purveyor of credit in the country is the Canadian commercial banking system. And they don't want competition. It's not corrupt. I don't think it's fair to say it's corrupt. It's just, in business school, we're taught, be anti-competitive. Take your competitors out if you have to, right? Nobody wants a fair fight. And I think the bankers are just being good businessmen. They don't want the government competing in the provision of credit in the country. That's basically what it comes down to.
Well, I think that's because what we actually have in this country is crony capitalism. If we had true capitalism and a truly free market, perhaps other players would get to play. Jeff, just in closing, I mean, you're talking about Bitcoin, and we're trying to figure out where to go from here. I mean, where would you like to see things go in the coming weeks and months, or even years, as far as monetary reform. You're in Mexico right now, but I mean, where would you like to see this go? We all have different ideas of where it should be. How do you think people should be living with money? I mean, where do you want to see it?
Oops.
Oh,
Well, I'll take that.
sorry, I lost a bit of audio on you there.
Sorry,
Jeff.
I'm back now. Sorry.
Okay, we got you back
I
now.
muted myself so I didn't bother you guys, and I forgot to unmute myself. But let me say that Meyer Amschel Bauer Rothschild was quoted as saying, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws."
Exactly.
And the central banks do control the money, and because of that, they have an incredible power. You asked me where I'd like to see things go. I'd like to see human beings wake up, take control of their own lives, become independent, not give away their power to government, which are an unnecessary evil, to start to take control of their own lives, to move towards things that aren't controlled by government, like things like Bitcoin, gold, and silver, and that would end all wars. It would result in a massive amount of prosperity because most of that money is stolen through various ways and destroyed through various ways. Including inflation, which is one of the most dangerous things ever invented, and that's no really good money should ever be inflated. And of course, Bitcoin really isn't. It is very slowly inflated over a long time period, and that's only just to get it issued into more hands initially, and then it reaches a certain point where it has no inflation whatsoever, which would make it the perfect money. So that's where I'd like to see it go. We'd end up with the most peaceful and prosperous planet possible if we got to that. With true free markets, everything would be private. So there would be private security, private courts, private everything. And your guest there brought up competition in a private market or a free market. Competition makes things better always. And what we're seeing right now, and what his point is as well, is the central banks have no competition. They have a monopoly. And one of the main reasons that people say we need government is because without it, we'd have so many monopolies. Well, government itself is a monopoly, and so is central banks, and they're the two most dangerous things you can possibly have on this planet.
I mean, so many responses to that, but I want to agree with a lot of it, but I'll just take it a little more maybe to the center of the mainstream. But we've experienced a period of global trade like none other in the history of the world. We've taken, when I was in high school, world GDP was 20 trillion. It's approaching 100 trillion today. So we have raised living standards. But the process by which we do international trade is just sausage making. Most people can't compete in it. It's obviously for the big players. And then the way we clear it and accept it, what he's talking about, right? How we do the acceptance behind all that international trade, that's all finance. And as I said, and as he intimates, nobody's in charge. And so it actually threatens the world trading system, which is producing such great benefits for society. And we've got a financial system that's still antiquated in the 1920s, 1930s, as far as I'm concerned. It was supposed to be independent. So you asked me what I would do. Well, the number one thing I would do is ring fence that Bank of Canada, put a proper board of directors around it, and make the guy answer, right? And then say to our international partners in BIS, you guys have got to perform there. Yeah. We've got to get some actual results. When they issue a policy at BIS, there's generally a paragraph at the end of it that says, all this is subject to national supervision discretion. The national supervisors can opt right out of it. And so it's just a free-for-all. It's a shit show in finance out there, and has been for decades and decades. Bitcoin, I think what they're trying to do in Bitcoin is a good thing. They're trying to add some competition. I'm not quite, I don't quite share that. You're going up against Visa, which is an enormous competitor. And I wish you all the luck in the world, but I don't want to destroy the system. I just wanted to do what it was originally set up to do, which was to be independent. Yeah. We have an independent judiciary in Canada. You can argue how effective it is. I think it's the best in the world and the best in human history. But we could have an independent fiduciary, financial trustees. We don't have that today.
Well, gentlemen, I do think we can say that I feel the three of us are certainly on the same page in regards to this monopolistic system of control around central banking that needs to be done away with. So, on that note, I want to thank my guests for joining us here today. And, let's just keep in mind at home that, that's what it really all boils down to, is is monetary reform. I mean, doing away with the central banking systems, and as Jeff said, it's the Rothschilds. When you create the banks, you create the laws. That's really essentially what it all comes down to. So I want to thank you for joining us this week, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be doing another a podcast with Jeff Berwick, and that's going to be airing on Mondays. So stay tuned for that. It's going to air this Monday on talknetwork.com. And I want to thank my guests, Jeff and Mike. And that is all for this week. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll be right back here on this channel, same time, same place, next week on youtube.com/weavingspider. Check the links in the description to where you can follow us, where you can donate, where you can become a PFT patron, and where you can learn more from our guests, Mike and Jeff. That's all for this week. We hope to see you next week. Thanks. It's all about truth. All of it. Every single thing. All boils down to the truth. We all want truth. The truth will set you free.